let's talk about the transit of Russian gas into Europe. So, while sanctions have been placed on Russian energy exports for quite a while now, there has still been a transit of Russian energy into Europe, gas into states like Slovakia, Austria, Hungary, for years now, since the Russians engaged in the big invasion in 2022 after the smaller scale invasion in 2014 when they annexed Crimea, parts of Donetsk, and Luhansk, breakaway region, and then, of course, the rest is history. But for this time period, we have always had some amount of Russian gas passing through Ukraine, even as the war went on. As troops invaded and crossed the border, the energy workers still were getting, instructions to help this energy transit through Ukraine, and it helped for two reasons. Number one, Ukraine got compensation for the transit. Number two, Ukraine also could look at its energy pipeline infrastructure and say, oh, it's going to stay safe, because if they cut it all off, well, then maybe the Russians blow it up. Maybe they have a reason to target it. Maybe it would mean less for them if Ukraine's Ukraine's energy infrastructure was completely decimated. Now they're destroying electricity production, but the gas pipelines are different than the electricity production. Now, this transit of gas has stopped for a few reasons. I would say one big reason is that the Ukrainians, and ahead of any potential deal in 2025, or in order to get the best position as they're trying to increase pressure on the Russians to have the most leverage, they want to make sure that the Russians are feeling economic pressure. And while the Ukrainians are going to be suffering about $800 million and compensation they would have gotten if they continue to go through this, the Russians are losing about $5 billion. And the last small dribblings, I'm not going to say dribblings, I should say something substantial, because it is at least somewhat substantial, but losing a lot of their remaining foothold in the European energy market. And what is going to replace it? Well, what's going to replace it is going to be Norwegian gas through pipes. It's going to be American and Qatari LNG exports, which have been replacing many of the former Russian consumers, as in nation states consuming Russian export. While Russia used to dominate about 35% of European energy markets, they've now been largely boxed out. And this is, in my eyes, at least Ukraine trying to further strangle it that much more. And there's still some pipelines, for example, while Slovakia and Austria are going to find alternatives in LNG export, so possibly American LNG, possibly Qatari LNG, the Hungarians are going to continue to get Russian imports. They're just going to do it through a separate pipeline that goes under the Black Sea, through Turkey, up into Hungary. So don't worry, Mr. Viktor Orban, you're going to be able to keep your cushy Russian imports. Now, I do think that this, from Ukraine's perspective, makes sense. They are facing probably one of the most, if not the critical point in the war, if not the most critical point in the war. Of course, there's multiple critical points before this, but in 2025, it's a question of how much munitions will there be left available to sustain the effort. And if Ukraine is pushed to a point of breaking and Russia's pushed to a point of breaking, the stakes increase, where a lot of the war has been stagnant territorially. And it's been a lot of resources being dedicated to trying to move that stagnant line. A lot of people have died. But if you don't have the munitions, if you don't have the men, if you don't have the morale, the position could become more volatile. And that volatility means that I think that it could possibly be a very important year. And even if it's not an important year for the idea of winning the war outright or either side reaching a breaking point, the leverage that you could retain economically through something like, for example, stopping $5 billion of extra income to Gazprom, which is reporting its first losses in a very, very, very long time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia is, in large part, funded off of the hydrocarbons market. And it's a real issue. It's a real issue for the Russians. And so I understand why the Ukrainians would want to up the economic pressure and would want this leverage in negotiations. Now, if you're Slovakia, if you're Austria, if you're Hungary, and you're highly still reliant on these imports, you're going to be angry. Now, your nation is not in a struggle for national survival in the same way that Ukraine is. So I think Ukraine being willing to pull the trigger on this after years of threatening to do so, but not doing so, as the Austrians and Hungarians have been asking for this to continually be sent through. I think that one reason that this has also, happened is that the Hungarians and the Slovaks have not really done the best diplomatic effort to stay on the Ukrainian good side. That is to say that while there are certainly more quiet-minded diplomats in Slovakia and quiet-minded diplomats in Hungary, the governments there have been more hostile towards Ukraine's struggle of survival. And from Hungarian statesmen, we have heard a type of sentiment of almost like annoyance at the fact that the Ukrainians didn't just roll over once the Russians came in, with some of Viktor Orban's inner circle even suggesting, and I believe even on one occasion Viktor Orban echoed a similar sentiment of, if the Ukrainians had just caved in at the start and therefore, let the Russians march on Kiev or gave the Russians everything they wanted, then we wouldn't be in this situation. And instead of seeing it, or at least, when we're talking about blame, looking at the Russians as the primary, you're the ones who decide to invade, you're the ones who brought about the situation, it seems to be placed on the receiving end of it, almost as if getting invaded, getting conquered, getting dominated, having your terms dictated to you is just kind of a way of life around here. And in one way that I was particularly sick when I heard it, when listening to one of Viktor Orban's inner circle, was him talking about the 1956 Soviet invasion of Hungary, where they came in, they killed a bunch of dissidents and people who were protesting against the Soviet regime at the time. And this person seemed to compare the Ukrainian defenders or the Ukrainian people in a way to those people in 1956, as in a non-flattering comparison, even though, of course, many Hungarians value those people, value the fact that they resisted. He did it in an unflattering comparison to say that they're resisting against impossible odds and they probably should have cut their losses while they were ahead. It's not only is it an unpatriotic comparison or unpatriotic point to make, I don't really think it's comparable. We're talking about the Soviet Union, which included Hungary, which included Ukraine, versus just Russia, with the support now of North Korea and the Belarusians, invading Ukraine militarily, which has its own army, its own force, and possible foreign backers, and there's a negotiating table that could be constructed. That's not comparable. There was no real negotiation in 1956 with the protesters. It was just they crushed them. They believed that the Hungarian government was reforming in a way that they were not willing to put up with. It's just a bad comparison all around. But the relationship between the Hungarians and the Slovaks have not been as amicable as lately. So I think they were willing to step over them this time, because why should you, as the Ukrainian government, not be willing to piss off the Hungarians if the Hungarians are going around your back and having these meetings with the Russians, continuing to consume these energy imports, not sending over any aid, and blocking every single aid package and sanctions plan brought up against the Russians? Why should they care about their energy imports under those circumstances? So, lastly, I'm just going to say the nation state that's going to be hit hardest around this is not going to be Hungary. It's not going to be Slovakia. It's not going to be Austria. It is going to be Moldova. Now, Moldova has its own dispute with the Russians, where the Russians are saying that the Moldovans owe them over $700 million for past gas supplies. Experts have tried to look into this number, and they say that it's wildly out of proportion, and that it's probably actually less than half of that. But, right now, with the re-election of Sandu, who is a pro-European Union political leader in Moldova, and with the recent very slim vote in Moldova to vote for trying to join the European Union, all while there are large, very bodacious claims about the Russians trying to interfere in the Moldovan elections through direct vote buying, trying to buy out people to vote against them joining the European Union and to vote against the pro-European Union politicians. The political pressure between Moldova, the political tension between them and Moscow right now is quite high. And so them trying to use the gas supplies which Transnistria, the breakaway region from Moldova, is highly reliant on for heating, right now in the crack of winter for pressure, this is something that Putin has done for a very long time. In fact, back in 2008, 2009, Putin did something very similar to the European Union in the middle of winter in order to try to get more favorable benefits for the Russians in a pipeline deal that they were making with the Ukrainians. And it worked, at least somewhat. And people froze to death in Poland. So this is not a new behavior, but it is behavior that is now affecting those in Transnistria, the breakaway region that Russia is supposed to be in some way protecting because they do have what they call quote-unquote peacekeepers there, is now on the bad end of Russian energy foreign policy. They're losing influence in Europe, and those who are reliant on Russian defense, like, for example, the breakaway state of Transnistria, as well as many other Moldovans, are the ones feeling the biggest pinch. I will say that in response to this, by the way, the Poles have stood up and said that they are going to provide emergency assistance to Ukraine if there is a negative response from Slovakia to pull electricity supplies to Ukraine. So while it is the Moldovans that are going to be the ones that are suffering the most from the energy cuts, the Slovaks are the ones that are threatening to pull electricity supplies to the Ukrainians in response to them stopping the transit of Russian gas through their territory while being invaded by Russia. They're saying that, well, if you're not going to provide us with Russian gas, if you're not going to sell us or help sell us the gas, which we're going to compensate the Russians with money for, money which they will then spend on the war effort, which will then be used to bomb Ukraine. If you will not do that for us, then we're not going to help transit electricity. Now, the Poles, in response to that, not wanting to, I guess you could say, loosen up the defense line in Europe, at this point in the war, when you're going into 2025, a new presidency is coming in, there's a lot of uncertainty. They've come up and said that they will provide emergency assistance in the event of Slovakia pulling that support. And that assistance will probably be necessary because Ukraine is dealing with energy outages at the moment, and the Russians are trying to knock out their electrical infrastructure going into this winter. And we still have the rest of January and February going into March, and it's going to be very cold across many parts of Ukraine. I was out east just like half a month ago working with a mortar crew, and I will tell you that the cold in those fields with the wind, it bites at your skin. If any of it's exposed, it makes it hard for you to bend your fingers. You feel the bone pressing against your skin. It's a type of cold that makes you curl your toes to see if you can still feel them. And, babushkas all across the country have to live with that. And so, electricity supplies right now are very, very important. Very, very important. And, of course, gas and heating supplies. Actually, here's an article about it right here if you guys wanted to read about it. It's with Offbeat Research. Winter training with the 100th Mechanized Brigade's Martyr Grew. So you can go check that out if you wanted to. We should very briefly touch on at least the frontline situation right now, because it is now 2025, and there are just some developments on the front line. The area right now, which is probably facing the most difficult situation, is Koryevo. Korakove. Sorry, it's Korakove. Koryevo is a different location. Korakove is seeing the Ukrainians pushed out entirely. As you can see here, while over the last few months we've seen the Ukrainians fight tooth and nail for many of these block houses, and the 33rd's tanks doing a lot of work of the south here, busting up Russian armored columns as they're trying to come up, busting up infantry formations as they try to hide out in little hidey holes in the little pockmarked landscape across the area. trying to take every inch with high costs. But at the end of the day, the Russians have the manpower, and they're continuing to push up here in southern Donetsk. And it is likely that the Ukrainians will have to pull out of the remainder of the little sliver that they have left, as the Russians are raising flags near the end of the western side of the city. And there is, of course, the threat of encirclement. And as you can see here, the road out from these villages that the Ukrainians are still in, there's not a lot of room to work with here. So the Ukrainians will probably have to make the decision in the near future, as in within the month, to pull out of this pocket entirely and go back to Constantinople. Now, I've been here in Constantinople with evacuation crews trying to move out civilians, babushkas and old men and other civilians, that just can no longer live in this area. It is wild that they've gotten up to here. I'm hoping they don't take it, but putting aside the defense of Constantinople, which I know a lot of people are looking towards to see how the fight for southern Donetsk will be decided. A lot of people say that the battle for Constantinople, and when I say a lot of people, at least a few of my compatriots, will determine the fate for southern Donetsk, just due to its location and the fact that once Constantinople's fallen, there's not really much left in southern Donetsk outside of a few small villages. That's not to say anything about Kramatorsk or Slovansk or northern Donetsk. It's just that this right here is the last of southern Donetsk. As for Pokrovsk, the Russians continue to try to push westward to the west to try to flank the city of Pokrovsk. They've not been able to get in any closer directly. And you can see videos like this, which are popping up, of course, all the time, of Russian soldiers trying to inch forward, getting taken out by drones. I was with FPV teams in southern Pokrovsk before I left about maybe 2.5 weeks ago. And I watched them work. I watched them take out Russian soldiers and Russian trucks as they were coming up. And attacking the city directly head on is a fool's errand for the Russians, and it's going to take a lot of personnel. And so what they're trying to do, as you can see, is move to the west so they can attack Pokrovsk from multiple sides. Because if they can push up to the outside of Mirograd, and then they can attack it from the east, the south, and the west, then it'll be much easier to take Pokrovsk. So I don't expect any direct assaults on Pokrovsk in the near future. I could see them try to do some positional fighting to try to take, for example, the villages or a little bit of area around here that isn't controlled by them yet. So it'll be easier to attack it from 3 sides once they do have it flanked. But mostly I think it's positional fighting to set up for a direct attack on the city itself. Most of the civilians have left last time I was there. I think, it has a pre-war population of about 60,000. I would say I'd be surprised if more than 5,000 to 6,000 people remain in the city as of this point. It is a shell of its former self. And I know that the statue that I actually posed with when I was there has been removed. I wonder if I could... This statue, they actually just removed it. They removed it just a few days ago to protect it. This is a statue of a young Taras Shevchenko. It's not the usual image that they have of Shevchenko with the big mustache and stuff. He's probably the most popular... No, he is certainly the most well-known Ukrainian historical figure, a poet, and possible member of a Ukrainian secret society trying to establish its independence. Big author, and I think possible member. I think he was a member. I'm trying to remember. Point is, though, big member or supporter of the Ukrainian national ethos, big public figure there. The statue got removed to protect it. And I remember visiting the statue in Hulepole of Nestor Makhno and seeing it get destroyed after it. It was really depressing. So I understand why they removed it. It's just always sad when they have to remove things that are so, that the city is quite known for. I mean, it's like right in the, city center. If you grew up in Pokrovsk, you grew up with that statue, in that spot, if you've lived there since it was put up. Orban is such a shit stain. Thank you, Batsy, for saying what we're all thinking.